what Hegel is saying about idea and spirit and all this other stuff that is propelling us in history forward, it doesn't matter to me. I would only value society in the sense that it relates to my values. And if I find discordance between my values and what I'm going for and society, then it's not a question of me conforming to society. It's a question of, okay, how much of myself can I get away with in society? Because all my value and my happiness and my meaning comes from my own self. Today, we're going to try to do a book review of Hegel's Reason in History, which I finished reading about a week ago. But since I was sick, I wasn't able to get a recording done about it. So the ideas are not so fresh in my mind. And I'm going to be relying on a pretty heavy outline throughout this review that I just wrote up outside of the video because not only because the ideas are not as fresh in my mind, but because Hegel is famously a difficult person to read and to pin down his ideas. So I'll be relying heavily on a outline as I do it. And I'm going to try to keep my review just to the work itself, just to this particular work called Reason in History, not to the broader consequences of Hegel in general, or Hegel's other books like The Phenomenology of Spirit. Books like that are so complex that they sort of deserve their own kind of review. So we won't be doing that. And I'll just start off with general impressions. In the first place, I think has been said before, but if you want the best introduction to Hegel, if you want the simplest way to get into Hegel's work as a whole, I think you could do worse than Reason in History. Reason in History seems to be that most straightforward presentation of Hegel's general idea of philosophy, presented in the most straightforward manner that I have seen. I hadn't read Reason in History up until this point, but when I tried to tackle the phenomenology of spirit, it was far more complicated than this work, and you get a better grasp of what Hegel is trying to do through this work because it's much more simplified. And particularly this edition right here, again, has an introduction by Robert S. Hartman, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Mexico. This edition was published in 1953, so I doubt he's still the professor of philosophy in the University of Mexico, but I found his introduction to be very helpful in understanding the rest of the work, and part of the review here is talking about what Professor Hartman has laid out in this introduction. The introduction itself is a substantial part of the book. It's perhaps a quarter of the entire book is just dedicated to his own introduction, which is par for the course when it comes to Hegel, to be perfectly fair. But I just wanted to express that I thought that in the first place, if you were interested in getting to Hegel's ideas, Reason in History is probably going to be your best bet for getting a simplified understanding of what he's talking about in his own words. And not only that, but the introduction by Professor Hartman at the beginning of the book was really helpful for framing what Hegel talks about in the rest of the work. Now, the way I'm going to go about this review is first to try to explain what I think Hegel is talking about here, relying heavily on my outline and relying heavily on the way that Professor Hartman presents it in the introduction, and then trying to sort of going over the content of the book, summarizing it, going over a couple of the key distinctions that Hegel makes, and then giving my own opinion on what I ever interpreted. Again, the biggest difficulty with Hegel is that it's really easy to misunderstand what he's saying, and oftentimes the first criticism that you get when you start to be critical of Hegel's philosophy is that you simply haven't understood what he's saying. And whether that holds true, I suppose, depends on how much of an expert you are on Hegel, but I'm going to do my best here. And I just hope that you would give me the benefit of the doubt. So with that, Hegel's intention, I believe, with this work is to try to understand the philosophy of history. What is the essential principle of philosophy of history? And Essentially, the main idea, which I've written down here on the outline, is this: history has a reason, and its reason is freedom, which is considered the idea realizing itself in spirit dialectically. The individual is a particular instance of this spirit, which is idea becoming aware of itself. The fullest realization of this freedom at any given point is in the state, understood as a spirit of a people. So, very quickly, I'm going to break down four key points to that main idea, and then I'm going to try to explain that main idea more fully as far as I can understand it. In encapsulating the main idea of what Hegel is talking about, I'm borrowing his terminology here. So the terminology of idea, of nature, of spirit, and of freedom. Now, again, Hegel in this work is trying to identify what is sort of the unifying principle of history. What is history, right? And he's saying the unifying principle behind history, its sort of reason, its internal logic, if you will, is freedom. It is the progressive development of freedom. But Hegel understands freedom in a very particular way. This is not the sort of Anglophone understanding of freedom. It's a very particular understanding of freedom. But before we can understand what freedom is, we have to understand a couple of more fundamental ideas here that are a part of the concept of freedom as Hegel uses it. The first term is that of the idea itself. In the main idea, I said, or sorry, in the main summary, I said that there is an idea in history realizing itself in spirit dialectically. So, as far as I can tell, the idea is sort of the fundamental logic of reality. It is the thing which sits behind existence or reality or being. And it has a structure that is dialectic, meaning that it proceeds in the world through what is called a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. And actually, I don't think Hegel ever uses the word dialectic in Reason and History, but this logic is really important in understanding what he's talking about. One way in which you could understand the dialectic is thinking in terms of how global problems get solved. So he thought about something like the development of representative democracy. You could look back at history and interpret it in a way where you could say, on the one hand, you had the interests of the general population, right, the masses, who were interested in equality and in sharing power, and then on the other hand, you had kings and aristocracy who believed that you needed certain kinds of rulers, perhaps um, particularly intelligent rulers who could guide the people towards real ends, right? And so, on the one hand, you sort of had like monarchy, autocracy, dictatorships, these kinds of government forms. And on the other hand, you sort of had mass democracy, right? Just tribalism, groupthink. And you had these tensions in history between the two that would devolve into revolutions and tyranny and oppression. You had a thesis, which was aristocracy or monarchy, and you had an antithesis or an antithesis, which was mass democracy. And historically, you can see these tensions coming into conflict with one another and then being resolved through something like representational democracy, where the people choose the best leaders to make the law. So it's not direct democracy, it's not monarchy, it's a synthesis of both. And what Hegel's essentially saying here is that all of reality in a fundamental way works in this dialectical way. We have different conflicts between things that ultimately resolve themselves in a synthesis and a greater development thereby. And this is especially in history. And originally, this takes place in nature, in the context of space time, essentially. Essentially, outside of any conscious awareness, outside of any explicit knowledge of this idea developing dialectically, this is what Hegel calls nature. So before man came about, the world was forming dialectically, materially through space time, with this dialectical logic sitting behind it and propelling it forward until the point where nature created man and therefore created spirit. Now, Hegel's use of the word spirit is essentially this process of dialectic that's been developing through history and nature, becoming aware of itself to one degree or another in human beings. Human beings wake up to the world, right? They become conscious of the world around them and they understand or become aware of, to one degree or another, the process of the idea working itself out in nature. But they are also, at the same time, a part of nature. And this gives rise to spirit. This gives rise to the idea becoming aware of itself, this dialectical process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis becoming aware of itself through the individual. And the development of this awareness of the idea proceeding in history is freedom. Freedom is the process of spirit, of self awareness, becoming more and more aware of itself. That is the idea behind the progress of history and the process of history, or the reason of history itself. So, freedom is not thought of in the sort of contemporary Western way of being free from physical force or being free in a positive way to have the resources necessary to achieve a certain end that you have in mind. It's not so much about power, it's really about humanity as a whole becoming aware of its own dialectical growth throughout history. And because human beings are an outgrowth of the idea in nature, this is really the idea becoming aware of itself through spirit, which is the self-awareness. A lot of these ideas are slippery. Um, I'm going to talk about later a way that I think I can understand this individually. But essentially, it's almost like Hegel was thinking about a I mean, I would call it essentially a spirit or a logic that exists in the structure of the world that through a process of conflict and resolution creates man who then becomes aware of this logic behind being itself and is at the same time a product of that logic. There's debate as to in Hegel's system as to whether this is the idea is in and of itself conscious or not, or it needs man to be conscious. He often connects it, as and I think he connects it in the reason and history to the idea of God. So one way you could think about this is almost from a Christian perspective of saying, God is working out some sort of process in history that human beings become progressively aware of. And the becoming progressively aware of this process in history is the development of freedom. And not only that, but the awareness of the process of this logic or this idea in history through spirit can only be understood backwards, not really forwards. So one has to look back at history to understand how spirit has developed over time. It's not a simple thing to sort of project it into the future. But we can see that the reason of history, or the thing that is progressing history forward, is freedom. It's spirit becoming ever more conscious of itself through history and through these conflicts and resolutions and syntheses of problems that push history forward, like we talked about with the monarchy, mass democracy, and democratic representationalism. And this understanding that has of history breaks people down into essentially four types of people. And this comes directly from the introduction in Professor Hartman, which I really appreciate. And the four types of people are this: there is the citizen. Now, the citizen is representative of the state. In fact, it might be useful to talk about the state. It might be useful to talk about the state before we get into these distinctions, because the state is really what Hegel believes drives all of history. History is not really necessarily about individuals and what individuals do, that they have a part to play, and we'll get more into that in a second. But it is states who are really the driving force of history, or the representation of spirit at any given time, representation of one's own self-consciousness. An individual becomes aware of the spirit through its nation, not through its himself. Um, and all of history is actually going towards a totally or ideally free state, that is a state that is completely aware of its own spirit. And the ideal or totally free state is one in which the individual person and their expression, like their behavior, what they do and think, and how they operate within that society, harmonizes completely with the state itself, especially in the realms of philosophy and culture and art, so that there is a complete harmony or coherence between any given individual within a state and what the spirit of that state expresses at any given point. There is no conflict, you might say, between the public and the private individual, but they are all in harmony with one. I think, in from what I understand from reading this, technically speaking, the state is not actually more important than the individual, or in higher priority than the individual in Hegel's scheme. But the idea as that the individual's greatest fulfillment of himself is actually in participation in the state. So in the ideal world, an individual would be completely fulfilled by his expression in state, in society. But in the real world, it's not so much that every expression of the individual is really in harmony with the state, but that his society, or his state, allows him to express the fullest realization of spirit, and therefore freedom, that is, consciousness of this dialectical process. It offers him the greatest possibility of that within the given paradigm, or the present paradigm in any given period. So the state in any given period is always the fullest realization of the individual in any given period. So this sets the context for four types of people that exist within history, and specifically in relationship to the state. The first is the citizen, and this is the individual subject as a representative of the state. So in any given period, there is a state. And in any given period, the state is the current iteration of spirit, the current iteration of the idea becoming aware of itself dialectically in history. And the citizen is sort of the person who lives in tune, you might say, with their given society, with their state, and they consider themselves moral and are moral, so long as they cohere with the state, so long as they cohere with the current iteration of the highest peak of freedom that is available to them, which is their own society and their own state. They become sort of relativistically more moral to the degree that they conform with the spirit of their society. So, if the spirit of the United States is freedom and equality, you might say that the most moral person in the society is whoever harmonizes best with the ideals of freedom and equality, something like that. And that would be the standard of morality for the person, insofar as they are a member of a state. But beside, and that would be the citizen, the category of citizen, right? And a person can be in any of these categories, or many of them at the same time. It's not really clear that there's a clear distinction between all of them. These are different ways of categorizing the individual in relationship to this idea of history. There is the person. So the person is the individual in relationship to absolute morality, and absolute morality is related to the nascent idea which abides in everyone as a result of absolute idea, meaning this logic which sits behind reality is sort of going somewhere, and within that idea there is a nascent, you might say, perfection or ideal state or total freedom, and you might say absolute freedom or absolute consciousness. And regardless of where along that process any given state is in the current moment, an individual relates morally also to this absolute freedom or this absolute idea. It can only really be understood backwards. So you might rejudge, for instance, a historical character based on whether in our own current understanding he uh, produced greater freedom or less freedom, but he had that same relationship to absolute morality when he was actually alive. It's only that we can only understand his relationship to that morality now. So there is sort of the person who is moral because they got along with their society, and there's also the person who is absolutely moral, who was a a force or was related to the principle of freedom that moved forward the course of history to greater and greater freedom. So somebody who was a rebel in the past might be considered moral today because the society in which they lived in is antithetical to where freedom sits today. But within that society itself, at that time, that person was immoral with regards to their broader society and actually lacked freedom. This leads into the third person, which is called the hero. And this is a person who sort of significantly carries the process of this dialectic, or this process of the ideal, or this process of spirit becoming aware of itself forward, often unconsciously. In Hegel's terminology, spirit sort of captures this person, and regardless of whether they're aware of it or not, they become the figure or the individual who moves the tension of the dialectic forward throughout history. And Hegel's major example of this was Napoleon. So Napoleon happened to be this individual that spirit was using in order to push forward the dialectical process of conflict and resolution. The thing about this person, again, you can really only understand this retrospectively. The thing about heroes is that at the time, again, they're breaking with the morality of the state. They go outside the bounds of what has been morally established already, pushing freedom forward in a very significant way. So it's not that they're an isolated hero, but that they do this sort of in a categorical way that everybody is sort of forced to go along with in one way or another. And they develop the spirit, but their own experience is going against their own society or the state in a sort of rebellious way and pushing the conflict forward that ultimately synthesizes into something better. But in the moment that they're pushing this conflict forward or this dialectic forward, they are unconscious that they are doing that. And you couldn't tell in the moment whether or not they're a hero. You can only tell that retrospectively. And Hegel thinks that when we look at Napoleon retrospectively, he was a hero because he pushed forward this conflict that ultimately led into a greater synthesis and a greater freedom of spirit. And lastly, the last type of person is called the victim. And this is the subject, or you might call it the citizen, who is sort of caught up in this conflict between the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis, struggling towards spirit. And it's left behind by the progress or the mechanism of transition, right? So uh, the most straightforward example I can think of is something like war. Hegel would look at war as historically significant as a process of the conflict between thesis and antithesis for the sake of synthesis. And there's many individual people, many individual citizens who, within that conflict, get swallowed up and destroyed. Um, and these are victims. These are the people who are left behind by progress, right? Who are ultimately destroyed or unable to reconcile themselves to the new spirit of history, the new level of freedom, so to speak. These are all the people, you might say, that history sweeps over and forgets completely. And so, in summary, I guess what Hegel here is trying to say is that there is a principle, there is something which is moving history forward through people towards greater and greater self-awareness, greater and greater freedom. And it is not individual consciousness, it is using individual people, but at the same time, it is made up of individual people. That means like it can't get its significance without individual people, but it is also more than any given individual. History is more than any given individual. It is the story of great men, heroic men, pushing forward the progress of history through time and through conflict, overcoming obstacles, leaving behind the old to embrace the new. um, people can be judged morally in two ways. They can be judged in terms of their society, and they can be judged in terms of history, in terms of did they progress absolute freedom or not, right? And again, Hegel's main example of the hero is somebody like Napoleon. And Hegel believed, well, I guess that's getting out of this book in general, but this is what he means. So history is a process of the idea behind reality becoming progressively aware of itself through spirit, which is represented in human awareness of being. And this spirit becomes progressively more and more aware of itself and aware of being. And this produces freedom for Hegel. And this is the principle and the reason behind history. It's the progressive self or the progressive awareness of spirit over time. So history is constantly geared towards freedom. And most importantly, for the political implications, the state at any given time, the society in which one lives at any given time, is the fullest realization of this freedom at any given point in history. And because that's going to lead to all sorts of conflicts later when it comes to Hegel's philosophy. So, with all that being said, what can I say about Hegel? Well, the first thing I can say is that Hegel is so complicated that sometimes it is hard to know where to even push back, because so much of this is slippery. I mean, the fact that so many people have had such difficult time interpreting what Hegel even means by something like idea or spirit or freedom, the fact that, I mean, I was even having a hard time defining these kinds of things, though I think I captured the right picture, belies the fact that Hegel really understood what he was talking about necessarily. Now, to be fair, the ideas that he's trying to grapple with, I think, are very complex and especially ontologically complex. And he's trying to do this um, without being objective to existence itself, and this causes all kinds of difficulties. But, it doesn't surprise me that later movements in British philosophy and early 20th century philosophy would be so interested in clarity of concept, because of the influence of somebody like Hegel, where he was so slippery, probably because it was so difficult, that it was hard to even really understand what he was saying in the first place. But at the same time, you know that these ideas are powerful or influential or interesting because practically all of continental philosophy came out of Hegel as a result of this. This was both um, existentialism in terms of Kierkegaard's reaction to Hegel. Schopenhauer came out of this. Nietzsche came out of this, and most importantly, Marxism came out of Hegel and the sort of neo-Hegelianism of the Frankfurt School and the deconstructionists was also influenced by this same kind of philosophy. So there's powerful ideas here. There's powerful ideas here. You can't sort of dismiss Hegel simply because he is difficult to grapple with or because his ideas aren't clearly defined. There is something that he is talking about here. And I think, in terms, in the context of my own philosophy, because that's really the only way that I can understand this, he is saying something very interesting that I would relate to individual people, which is, for instance, and this is something that Kierkegaard harped on, but the individual's life is something that is hard to predict going forward. It's something you have to understand backwards, like the meaning of one's life, how the events in one's life have built up to the person you are today and the meaning that you hold today is frankly an essential part of the analysis of yourself. And much of your self, that is what you value, is beyond your direct consciousness. Much of your total self is beyond your direct consciousness. It's something that you gradually become more aware of and act more directly on the further that you progress in your own history as an individual. And the way that I talk about authenticity is very close to the way that Hegel is talking here about history. when I talk about authenticity, this is the fact that you'll never know the totality of who you are, but by acting in the world and examining yourself and your past, you come to a fuller understanding of who you are. You become more conscious of who you are. And so you're able to pursue who you are more directly. And Hegel's kind of saying something like this about history. What does history reveal to us? It reveals to us the progress of humanity throughout history. It says something about what it means to be a human being if we look backwards and analyze history as an idea that is developing through the progress of nations and peoples. It tells us something about what human beings value, what we're after, what's a telos, and all of these kinds of things sit outside of our awareness. And it is through something like philosophy and the philosophy of history that we come to understand the underlying ideas that sit behind our own history that we were otherwise unconscious or aware of. And so, I mean, if you wanted to distill the most important structure um, behind the thought of Hegel, I think it's exactly that kind of thread. And, you can have that thought without at the same time going as far as Hegel is by saying there's a spirit behind history or an idea behind everything that is deterministically progressing the history of the world in a way that we can directly understand. I think it ultimately consciousness ultimately comes down to individuals and not there's not a consciousness which sits behind consciousness. There is only individual peoples who are individually aware of their own existence, but the same structure of consciousness that Hegel is talking about is incredibly applicable to the individual. The danger of this philosophy is precisely that it doesn't care so much about the individuals that history sweeps over. And this makes sense. I mean, again, if we bring this back down to the level of individual, if I get a skin cell that comes off my arm, now that's just a part of my total self at one point. I don't really care all that much about it because it's not essential to who I am. It's not essential to where I'm going. And it's not an essential part of who I was. It's a very interior part of my own self understanding. And in the same way, if we are only individual instances of this greater spirit, and spirit moves along, then the people who get left behind or are destroyed in the process are less important than the progress itself. And so, from a historical point of view, I could understand what Hegel is sort of emphasizing here. But this becomes incredibly absurd when we realize there is no ultimate spiritual consciousness, right? Um, it surprised me because Hegel is not actually anti-individual. He really actually emphasizes the importance of the individual, both in his idea of a person in relationship to absolute morality, meaning that an individual can be supramoral, that is, he can be immoral in relationship to his society, but moral in relationship to this absolute ideal of freedom. But not only that, the state in Hegel's scheme is not more important than the individual. What he is saying is that society is progressing towards a place where there is no discord between the individual and society, but these are in absolute harmony with each other. He just views one's social orientation as the real fulfillment of who one is. And there's arguments to be made there. Of course, much of what it means to be a person is social, and much of our fulfillment comes from our relationships with other people. But again, when this becomes the justification to annihilate the individual in favor of the abstracted state, this is the real danger that comes in. This is where interpretations of Marxism and Nazism later, in the next century, this is where a lot of these ideas would go. And this was never Hegel's intention for his philosophy, but it was often the consequence of his philosophy that people took the spirit of the state to be far more significant and important than the individual in and of themselves. And this gave many people a philosophical framework in order to justify the violence and oppression of individual people. And really, the flaw with that entire idea of the state being a real fulfillment of the individual is that the state is nothing but individuals, right? It doesn't get so far as the state actually gets its value, it gets it through the valuing individual. But if an individual does not voluntarily participate within a state, doesn't voluntarily participate within an organization, then the individual does not value it. It is only valued by the people who are enforcing it through force and violence and domination. And so the meaning of the state becomes incredibly diminished if it is put within a voluntary context, because most states would fall apart without some sort of force, violence, or domination. The last part I'm going to talk about that really sticks out to me about this, that actually is important from Hegel, is the idea to which the historical context and the state and civilization actually comes to, I guess, create the context and the material for the individual to find themselves in, right? The authentic self is a nascent self in the sense that it's not fully developed. It has to develop itself uh, through, we might say, the exterior world or the objective world. And this includes the material world, but it also includes culture, language, custom, religion, law. The person is forced to objectify themselves, right? Objectify their nascent self through the cultural and physical material that surrounds them. And so Hegel's emphasis on the role of sociality in the individual's life is incredibly important to consider. And this would be taken up again by the essentially the post-structuralists. I know that's a broad label, but essentially the post-structuralist movement that was reacting against the radical freedom of Sartre, where you're saying, regardless of what individual experience of freedom and choice that you have, the fact is that you are radically constrained by the culture um, and circumstances that you find yourself in, and the material circumstances that you find yourself in, and then everything has to go through that context. Now, I think the post-structuralists take this to a radical degree, and they attack ideas like truth and reason and morality through the same kinds of lens and sort of undermine their own ethos. And you wonder about the degree to which their own views can be relegated down to cultural artifacts rather than the actual truth of being or the actual truth of self. So I think that's partially where it falls apart. But the structuralist and post-structuralist opposition to the understanding of the self comes directly out of this thrust that Hegel himself was talking about in Reason and History, where he is saying how much of the person is brought forward through history by the state, by society, and how the person fundamentally relates themselves to society through this kind of development. Even if you are reacting against your society, then you're part of the dialectic. You're part of the same logic, right? You are the antithesis of the thesis of society, and so you are being drawn forward by the same kind of underlying dialectical logic. The question is, can we get outside the dialectic? I think we can. The idea of course, the dialectic itself is it runs into the problem of infinite regress, which is sort of, okay, what's the dialectic to the dialectic, right? If you have to posit the dialectic to understand being itself, the logic behind ideas, and at the same time you would have to posit, you could say, stable being or being, right? You have to posit being and becoming. And if you're positing dialectic and the opposite of the dialectic at the same time, the question becomes, okay, well, where's the role of non-contradiction, right, in Hegel's logic? And absolute dialectic necessarily discards absolute morality. If the morality of a society is only based in the whatever sort of succeeds, then what other standard can we relate it to? I mean, this is a problem that Hegel ran into when he was applying his philosophy to the Prussian state, and you had the right Hegelians who were essentially saying, well, because the Prussian state is the state that is around, so to speak, this is proof of that it is the greatest synthesis that you have. Therefore, it is morally justified. And then you have the left Hegelians going in the opposite direction, saying, no, this means that there is something else coming down the pipeline that we need to get prepared for or develop ourselves. And you get this instability of morality, which even Marx struggled with. And so I think what's so interesting about Hegel in this book in Reason and History is that it is, in one sense, it's argued so poorly. It kind of just comes out of the blue, and there's no empirical evidence for things like the spirit behind history, and it's really all just speculation. I mean, you can't even ground it phenomenologically. or when you try to ground it phenomenologically, you just end up with the self, which at least can be phenomenologically verified. But the concept of the idea, I mean, this is, you can't get objective to it to really understand it, so it's complete speculation. But still, there is a thrust of the idea that really applies in a lot of different categories. And you find Hegel in so many ways in which we understand our own history, in which we understand contemporary philosophy. You get it both in the neo-Hegelianism of post-structuralism, as well as the the strong reaction against Hegel, which was the positive movement and the analytic movement that still pertains today. And so both of these movements are children of Hegel. You might say a, a thesis and an antithesis to which there needs to rise a new thesis. But the grounds of Hegel's argumentation are so flimsy that they can be easily dismissed. It's worthwhile trying to understand him because I think it gives you an interpretive frame for a lot of things that you can ground more solidly. And that's what makes it impressive, and that's what makes his influence impressive. But his foundations are just too flimsy to take it seriously. And to Kierkegaard's main criticism of this, it sweeps over the experience of the individual themselves. I mean, we only ever experience reality in the world that we're living in through the through our own experience of the world. We don't experience the world as spirit. We don't experience the world as idea. We don't experience the world as nature. We don't experience the world as state or society. We experience the world as an individual self, and our meaning comes from a self meaning. And so, even if it's true, what Hegel was saying about idea and spirit and all this other stuff that is propelling us in history forward, it doesn't matter to me. I would only value society in the sense that it relates to my values. And if I find discordance between my values and what I'm going for and society, then it's not a question of me conforming to society. It's a question of, okay, how much of myself can I get away with in society? Because all my value and my happiness and my meaning comes from my own self. And that's really the main criticism that I would have, or again, along Kierkegaardian lines of, we don't experience the world as state. We don't experience the world as spirit. We experience the world as ourselves. And that's the foundation of meaning. It's the foundation of why something like this philosophy would matter to a person at all, the individual. If you overcome the individual in favor of the state or the spirit or whatever other speculative idea, the whole reason for understanding this in the first place falls. So anyway, that is my thoughts on Hegel's Reason in History. Amateur book review. I have already finished my next book, which was the 11th volume of Frederick Copplestone's A Philosophy of History, titled Logical Positivism and Existentialism. What's actually interesting about this book is that it is not a history. It is a collection of critical essays on the two essentially contemporary ideas, contemporary schools of philosophy and history that was written by a philosopher of history that was born at the beginning of the century and died at the end of the century. So he really saw both the birth and the death of well, he really saw the birth and the transformation of these philosophies over time. And he has a really interesting and I would say wonderfully objective analyses of both of these movements that I will get into next time with you guys. So with all that being said, I hope that that you enjoyed this, that I was able to hopefully enlighten you a little bit on Hegel's philosophy and give you a different perspective on it. Uh, if you have any thoughts or comments or criticisms, if you think I got this interpretation wrong, which I almost certainly did, then please, drop your comments in the comments section and let me know where it went wrong or what your thoughts on this book are, what your thoughts on Hegel's philosophy are in general. I'd love to have those conversations with you guys and sort of hash these things out. If you liked this video, please give it a like. If you think that somebody else would benefit from this video, then please share it with them. And if you guys want more videos like this, then be sure to subscribe. And I will talk to you later.